Hey everybody, it's Joe from greenlightsound.com, and today we're going to take a look at a technique from a mixer we haven't talked about on the channel yet, and that is Mark Spike Stent, one of the best mixers of the past several decades. Check out his credits if you don't know who he is. Amazing mixer with a ton of great credits to his name. And we're going to talk about specifically his mix bus EQ, what he puts on his master or stereo or mix bus that the mix is put through that allows him to use less of the top end EQ on each individual channel. His favorite console is the SSL G series, so he can avoid the top end EQ of that or use less of it because he's putting that entire mix through the EQ. And the EQ he uses is a hardware GML 8200 mastering EQ. Now, there's not a specific plug-in version of that, but this one from Brainworks, the AMEK EQ 200, is based upon the GML and Suntech, which is kind of like a very similar EQ to the GML, based upon those, and gives you kind of the same curves as that top end of the GML. But really, these are very clean EQs, very different from somebody like Andrew Sheps, for example, who uses a Pultec, which gets you some unique curves, but also some harmonic distortion and tubey goodness as part of the Pultec's architecture. This is all very clean EQ, which means we can actually copy the setting on a standard digital EQ, like a FabFilter Pro Q3, or even your stock EQ in your DAW, and I'll show you how we can do that in a couple of minutes. But first, let's take a look at the settings here on the AMEK EQ. You can totally ignore the left-hand side here because we're going to use our right-hand side. They're linked. They are exactly the same. Settings in the left and right, identical. So you're boosting a shelf 3.5 dB at 10K, 10,000 hertz. If you're using this specific EQ, I don't have the low-pass or high-pass filters on. They are default on. I turn them off. I also set this bottom panel to digital instead of analog, so the left and right channels are identical, not different. When it's analog mode, the Brainworks tolerance modeling technology kind of varies the left and right channel. I want it the same for both. And because this EQ does boost a little bit of the overall signal when you're boosting that top end, I brought the output gain down 0.2 dB. So again, a shelf at 10K, 3.5 dB. I'm going to bypass it first. It's going to be off, and just hear a little snippet of the track without this EQ engaged. Now I'll engage the EQ, play the exact same part. Now I'll bypass it on and off as it plays. So you can really hear how much of a difference it makes to the top end, really opens it up. Now, if you don't like how much that is, you can pull back on how much you're pushing through. You don't have to do 3.5 dB. You can pull it back a little bit if that seems too bright. Spike Stent's mixes tend to be a little bit on the bright side, so I wanted to push it and make it a little bit more obvious. Now, let's say you don't have this AMEK EQ 200 or a hardware GML 8200, and you want to achieve the same effect. Well, the good news is you can really do it with pretty much any standard digital EQ. So if you take a look over at Plugin Doctor, I've got the AMEK EQ pulled up again with the exact same settings, 3.5 dB boost at 10K on the shelf setting. Everything else identical. And the plot we get with that is this. There's our high shelf right there. Now I brought Pro Q3 into Plugin Doctor. I'll put that line on as well. And I just tweaked the settings until I got those two lines to match as closely as I possibly could on that shelf on top. The settings I came up with were two shelf bands. The first shelf band is at 4589.6 Hertz plus 4.13 dB with a Q of 0.417. The second shelf band was 20,258 Hertz, negative 2.12 dB with a Q of 0.295. So to capture this kind of unique shape of the GML or AMEK EQ, where it kind of goes up and then tapers off a little bit at that top end, I had to put a second shelf down here to pull down a little bit. But you can apply those settings if you've got FabFilter or your own stock EQ and kind of match that curve. So again, two high shelves from the FabFilter, one boosting, one cutting slightly, and that matches the exact curve. So now if we jump back into the DAW, I've got both plugins up again. I'm going to bypass the AMEK EQ and hear the Pro Q3 doing the same job the AMEK did a second ago. And then I'll bypass that, go back to the AMEK. I'll bypass the Pro Q on and off. I'll start with it off. And the same thing with the AMEK, starting with it off. Now what I'll try to do is jump back and forth between these two and see if we can hear a difference. I'll start with the Pro Q bypass and the AMEK engaged. So really, really similar between those two, kind of matching the curve of the top end of the AMEK EQ with the Pro Q3. You could kind of do the same thing with your stock EQ and your DAW if you wanted to try to match curves that way. So there we have it, a nice way to add some top end to your mix from a great mixer, Spike Stent, using the AMEK EQ 200 from Brainworks based upon the GML 8200 EQ. If you have any questions or comments, let me know in the comment section down below. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already, so we can keep you in the loop as to what's coming up next, and I'll see you in the next one.